EVO. Dr. Margaret Sinclair should have recognized the smell the moment her archaeological team broke through the sealed chamber wall on August 15th, 1987. Sweet copper pennies and rotting flowers. The scent her grandmother had taught her to fear. The one that meant something had died badly and refused to stay dead. Instead, she was thinking about funding deadlines and, university politics as she squeezed through the narrow opening that her team had carved in what should have been solid foundation stone. Hermitage Castle had already yielded 3 seasons of disappointing finds. Pottery shards, rusted weapons, the usual detritus of medieval life. This hidden chamber, discovered only when ground-penetrating radar revealed an impossible void beneath the Great Hall, this represented her last chance to justify the project's existence. The beam of her flashlight swept across walls covered in symbols that predated any known Celtic script, across shelves lined with books bound in leather that felt wrong beneath her fingers, across a stone table stained with substances that her rational mind refused to identify. But it was the discovery in the chamber's center that would haunt Dr. Sinclair for the rest of her life. A lead coffin, its surface crawling with Latin inscriptions that seemed to move in the flickering flashlight. And something else, inside, that had been scratching at the metal from within for 700 years. The thing that had once been William de Soulis was still trying to get out. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Castle of the Damned, Episode 1, The Necromancer's Bargain. Today we venture into the Scottish borders, where a medieval fortress conceals evidence of humanity's most catastrophic experiment with supernatural power. A bargain that transformed a man into something else entirely, and left his castle as a gateway between worlds that held doors that should never be opened. This is Chapter 1, The Keeper of Forbidden Knowledge. Ring out wild bells to the wild sky, the flying cloud, the frosty light. The year is dying in the night. Ring out wild bells and let him die. Alfred Lord Tennyson, he understood that some years deserve to die, that some chapters of human history are much better left buried. But he never encountered a place like Hermitage Castle, where the past refuses to remain past, where 7 centuries of accumulated evil saturates the very stones with malevolent purpose. The archaeological record tells us that William de Soulis inherited Hermitage Castle in 1304, but the local tradition preserved in border ballads suggests he inherited something far more dangerous. A library of texts that no Christian soul was ever meant to read, gathered by generations of de Soulis lords who valued knowledge over salvation. Contemporary chroniclers describe William not as a traditional medieval warrior, but as something unprecedented in the violent world of the Scottish borders. A scholar knight whose interests in ancient texts and forbidden learning marked him as dangerous, even among men accustomed to casual brutality. The Chronicle of Lancercost notes that William possessed books written in scripts unknown even to learned men, and spent more time in study than in warfare, though his studies pertained to subjects that would chill the blood of any righteous soul. Now, what made William de Soulis different from other medieval collectors of esoteric knowledge was not the scope of his library, but his systematic approach to applying what he learned. Beginning in 1310, William began conducting what can only be described as experiments, carefully documented attempts to test whether the rituals described in his ancient texts could actually produce supernatural results. The evidence for these experiments comes from an unexpected source. William's own meticulously kept journals, discovered during Dr. Sinclair's 1987 excavation of that sealed chamber. Written in a mixture of Latin, medieval Scots, and scripts that linguists have never fully successfully identified, these journals provide a detailed record of 5 years spent methodically exploring the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural worlds. William's early experiments were modest by the standards of what would follow. His journal entries from 1311 describe attempts to communicate with local spirits, using techniques derived from Celtic traditions that predated Christian influence in the borders. These initial efforts appear to have been successful. William records detailed conversations with entities he identifies as the old ones who dwelt here before Rome, before Christ, before the light drove them into the shadow. But communication was never William's ultimate goal. His journal entries reveal an intelligence driven by questions that would have horrified his contemporaries. Could supernatural entities be bound to serve human will? Could the barriers between life and death be deliberately breached? Could a mortal soul be strengthened through alliance with powers that existed beyond the reach of divine judgment? By 1314, William's experiments had evolved far beyond simple spirit communication. Archaeological analysis of the chamber's stone table revealed residues of substances that suggest sophisticated ritual practices involving blood, silver, and organic compounds that 20th-century chemistry just couldn't identify. More disturbing were the burn marks discovered on the chamber's walls. Patterns that suggested the presence of intense heat generated from within the chamber rather than from an external source. The transformation of Hermitage Castle during this period reflects William's growing confidence in his supernatural experiments. The architectural changes he commissioned between 1314 and 1318 created what architectural historians describe as the most sophisticated ritual space in medieval Scotland. A fortress redesigned to channel and contain supernatural energies according to principles that have no precedent in Christian or even Islamic tradition. And most significantly, William's journals record his discovery of what he calls, quote, the Great Work, a ritual process that promised to grant extraordinary power to anyone willing to pay the required price. The specifics of this ritual remain unclear, partly because William wrote about it in scripts that remain undeciphered, but the general outline is preserved in a mixture of Latin and medieval Scots that provides chilling insight into the bargain William was contemplating. Chapter 2. The Price of Power. So many worlds, so much to do, so little done, such things to be. Tennyson captured the relentless ambition that drives certain souls beyond the boundaries of mortal limitation, the hunger for achievement that makes some men vulnerable to offers that promise everything while demanding the one thing no rational person should surrender. William de Soulis' journal entries from 1318 reveal a man who had pushed his supernatural experiments to their logical conclusion and discovered that logic, when applied to the otherworldly, leads to places where human reason becomes not just useless, but actively dangerous. His careful documentation of ritual procedures gives way to increasingly frantic accounts of phenomena that he could no longer control or fully understand. The entity that William identified as the teacher had begun responding to his summoning rituals with offers that went far beyond simple knowledge or, minor supernatural assistance. The teacher, according to William's journals, claimed to represent a class of beings that had ruled the earth before humanity's ascension. Entities whose power rivaled that of angels, but whose allegiances lay with neither heaven nor hell. What made the teacher's offer attractive to William was its apparent reasonableness. Unlike the demonic pacts described in medieval literature, which demanded immediate damnation in exchange for temporary power, the teacher promised something that seemed almost like a business arrangement. William would serve as an earthly representative for the teacher's interests, using his position to gather information and facilitate certain, as yet unspecified, activities. In exchange, he would receive knowledge and abilities that would make him the most powerful lord in the Scottish borders. The price, as described in William's journal, seemed modest. Quote, "The teacher asks only for partnership, for willing collaboration in enterprises that will benefit both mortal and immortal interests. I need not surrender my soul, only share it, allowing the teacher to experience mortal existence while I gain access to immortal wisdom." End quote. So William's acceptance of this bargain, recorded in his journal entry for October 31st, 1318, marked the beginning of changes that would transform both the man and his castle. The ritual itself, as described in William's increasingly erratic handwriting, involved a carefully choreographed sequence of invocations, the burning of substances that produced what he called, quote, "sweet smoke that carries consciousness beyond the boundaries of the flesh," end quote, and the voluntary opening of his mind to direct contact with the teacher's essence. The immediate effects, according to William's journal, exceeded his wildest expectations. He found himself possessed of knowledge that spanned centuries. Detailed information about the movements of English armies, the secret alliances of Scottish nobles, the hidden weaknesses of kings and commoners alike. More intoxicating still was his discovery that he could now perceive the supernatural world directly, seeing spirits and otherworldly entities as clearly as he saw his human servants. But the partnership that William had eagerly embraced quickly revealed aspects that his journals suggest he had not anticipated. The teacher's presence in his mind was not the occasional visitation he had expected, but a constant companion whose interests and priorities began to override his own. William's journal entries from late 1318 describe growing confusion about which thoughts originated from his own mind and which came from the entity that now shared his consciousness. More disturbing were the physical changes that began manifesting by early 1319. William's servants reported that their lord's appearances had begun to alter in subtle but unsettling ways. His eyes reflected light differently in darkness. His voice carried undertones that made listeners uncomfortable. His touch left lingering sensations that some described as burning cold. The teacher's influence also extended to Hermitage Castle itself. The building began experiencing phenomena that defied rational explanation. Rooms that were larger inside than their external dimensions suggested, corridors that led to destinations that changed based on the walker's intentions, and chambers that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. By 1320, William de Soulis had achieved everything the teacher had promised: power, knowledge, and abilities that made him effectively invincible by medieval standards. But his journal entries from this period reveal a man who had begun to understand the true cost of this bargain. The teacher was not content to remain a passive partner. It was using William's body and position to advance an agenda that William glimpsed only in fragments, but which filled him with growing horror. Chapter 3. The Reckoning. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone, embrace. The final entries in William de Soulis' journal, written in a hand that becomes increasingly erratic before deteriorating into symbols that no human language has ever used, document the last weeks of a partnership that has become indistinguishable from possession. By September of 1320, William had realized that the teacher's true purpose was not the accumulation of earthly power, but the systematic corruption of human souls on a scale that would fundamentally alter the spiritual balance between good and evil. The teacher was using Hermitage Castle as a base of operations for influencing other nobles, other scholars, other ambitious men who might be tempted by offers of supernatural knowledge. William's attempts to sever his connection with the teacher proved unsuccessful and increasingly dangerous. The entity that had once been content to share his consciousness now fought for complete control, subjecting William to experiences that his journal describes as, quote, torments that exceed anything devised by mortal imagination, agonies that burn without consuming, deaths that offer no release. The final readable entry in William's journal, dated October 15, 1320, reveals his desperate plan to end the partnership that had become slavery. I have found the ritual in the oldest texts, the one practice the teacher fears. To sever our bond requires the complete destruction of the flesh that houses both mortal and immortal consciousness. But I am no longer alone in this body, and what dies here may not remain dead. I pray that God will judge my sacrifice sufficient to contain what I have unleashed. What happened in Hermitage Castle on October 31st, 1320 is documented not in William's journal, but in the testimonies of his servants, preserved in the records of Melrose Abbey. Their accounts describe a night of supernatural violence that culminated in William de Soulis' apparent death, but a death accompanied by phenomena that suggested the story was far from over. The servants testified that demonic voices continued to speak from William's corpse for hours after his breathing and all signs of life had ceased, that his body moved and struggled against its bonds despite showing no signs of life, and that the temperature in the death chamber dropped so precipitously that frost formed on the walls even though it was still autumn. Most significantly, they reported that the castle itself seemed to resist their efforts to remove William's body, with doors that refused to open, corridors that suddenly led in circles, and walls that bled when touched. Only the arrival of Franciscan monks from Melrose Abbey, armed with relics and holy water, allowed the servants to finally extract their master's remains from the castle. The monks' decision to seal William de Soulis in lead and then stone and then more stone reflected their understanding that they were dealing with something that exceeded conventional death. Their records indicate that the body continued to show signs of supernatural animation even after being placed in the lead coffin, necessitating additional layers of containment and protective wards. Tennyson wrote of faith persisting in the face of doubt, but William de Soulis' story represents something far more troubling: doubt that persists in the face of faith. Ambition that refuses to acknowledge divine limitation, intelligence that pursues knowledge regardless of the cost to the soul that seeks it. His bargain with the teacher was not a moment of weakness, but the logical conclusion of a mind that valued power over wisdom, that confused learning with understanding, that believed human will could master forces that existed beyond human comprehension. The archaeological discovery of William's hidden chamber and his preserved journals provides us with unique insight into medieval attitudes toward supernatural power, but it also forces us to confront questions about the nature of evil that remain relevant 7 centuries later. Was William de Soulis a victim of demonic deception, or was he a willing collaborator in his own damnation? Can human beings truly bargain with supernatural forces, or are all such agreements merely elaborate forms of spiritual suicide? But William de Soulis' death was not the end of his story. In 1987, Dr. Sinclair's archaeological team discovered that the lead coffin in the hidden chamber was no longer sealed. Something had clawed its way out from the inside. And in the decades since that discovery, Hermitage Castle has been the site of supernatural activity that suggests that the teacher's influence was never fully contained. Next time on The Castle of the Damned, the modern investigation into Hermitage Castle's continued supernatural activity, the price paid by those who dare to study William de Soulis' legacy, and the terrifying possibility that some bargains with darkness are designed to echo across centuries. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on The Devil Within. The Devil Within is an EVO production recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.